Since the middle of the 18th century there has been a house at Paxton, sitting high above the Tweed, silently watching the wax and wane of the water, the passing of the seasons, and the cycle of birth and death. But have you ever wondered what the landscape was like before it was built? How many generations have walked beside the river? Who were they, and how did they live? When the plans for the estate were drawn up, the fields, the roads, the village of Paxton were all there, almost as they are today. Over a century earlier, King Charles I and his army of 20,000 men, on their way to challenge the Scottish Church, camped on the banks of the river near Paxton. But who were the people who were here before maps and written records, before history itself? Who were the first pioneers to walk through the woodland beside the Tweed and Whittaker, travelling into an unknown world, ruled by wild beasts and danger, where every sound might be a threat, and having enough to eat was never certain? In 2010, the Paxton Before the House Community Project was set up to look for clues into the ways our ancestors lived.
Inevitably there was a whole lot of preparatory work and planning and getting funding for it, but there was a meeting held here in the Paxton Trust premises. A lot of members of the local members of the public came along, and it proceeded from there. We know a lot about the history of my family and the architecture and the furniture and everything else since the 18th century. But there must have been people here for hundreds of years, thousands of years before that, and that's the interesting one. We know about Paxton since the house was built. I want to know more about Paxton before the house. It is fascinating to find the remains and to understand the continuity of human occupation of this part of the world. Long before anybody thought of England or Scotland or even Britain, there were people here.
The project was open to everyone who was interested, and people of all ages took part.
I got involved when my mum thought it would be a good idea for the whole family to go down and see what it was all about and have a bit of fun. I think I was one of the youngest there. I liked all the getting dirty in all the mud. We're digging at Chesterfield. I was mainly digging and marking out the trenches, and then they found a bit in the soil change, so I had to get a sample of that. We did the sample where you had to just get a trowel and then get a bit of the soil and then put it in a container, and they sent it away to get it examined. I did enjoy the archaeology, but I'm not sure if I'll take it on later in life.
The first families who lived between the Tweed and the Whittaker, 11,000 years ago, would have walked along the valleys following the river from its mouth, not as it is now, a short journey away, but a 20 or 30 mile trek from the coast. Sea level was much lower, connecting Britain to the continent. Our ancestors were following the herds, moving along the valleys through the woodland glades, making camp as they went, hunting, fishing, gathering any food that nature provided, searching for the raw materials to make their stone tools. Very little remains to tell their story. The archaeologist's search began by looking at what was lying on the surface.
You find these pieces of flint just by walking around and looking at the ground. And if you're a complete beginner like I was, I didn't know what we were looking for, but gradually by listening to the archaeologists and looking around, begin to get your eye in, and you can find them. Small pieces of flint, just about that size. And the best way to do it is to walk in a line and look down at the ground to make sure you don't go over the same ground twice. Although sometimes that can work, because the light shining one way, when you turn to go the other way, you can see things you missed going round the first time. And you wouldn't find them all over the field. There would be in a little area where the person had been working, and then they would just all the pieces would land in a little circle around your feet. They would have used flint to break other pieces of flint, and they make sharp edges for tools, for scraping or for arrowheads or various things they used in those days. On the ground you would find little pieces which would have been flakes off a tool, or sometimes you would find a piece of a tool which had been started but had broken off and they had thrown it away, and they just pick up another one, keep going. So you would find little bits of these lying around. Well, this is a piece of flint which was found on the surface of the ground, and it's a biggish piece, but most of the pieces you find are probably half that size. And as you can see, it's been chipped off there, and that edge there is very, very sharp indeed. I mean, you can cut with that, you could scrape skin with that. On another occasion, they were walking along the banks of the river, which further down, and they found one or two lithics, and the girl who was with them found an axe head. And so that was significant, but a piece had broken off. But once you picked it up and looked at it closely, you could clearly see it had been shaped into an axe head. There was one particular occasion, as I can remember, we were all wandering around trying to find stuff on the ground, and we really had no idea what we were looking for. And the archaeologist said, well, actually we're looking for pieces of flint about the size of your thumbnail, and they're hard to find. And just with that, one man said, you mean something like this? And he had bent down and picked up a piece of flint and handed it to the archaeologist, and he said, exactly that. It was a Bronze Age arrowhead.
Field walking only shows us a fragment of the picture. With the help of modern technology, hidden secrets can be revealed.
We have probes which go into the ground, and it's almost like a Zimmer frame, if you like. It can then be plugged into the record into a computer, and you can actually see what's in the ground without excavating. It's measuring resistance within the ground to perhaps a metre or 2 metres depth. So you divide it up into squares, march up and down, there's your survey.
What does this mean to the archaeologist? The green areas show where there may be interesting features to dig, but it doesn't always have all the answers.
I think luck plays a considerable amount in archaeology too, and it was day one we decided just outside the chapel where we were going to dig. A day later, having opened up the trench, we found the kist. In the kist we found a beaker, inverted, which is very peculiar. We're not quite sure why this was the case, that they were always put in upside down. It contained human remains. When we had the remains dated by analogy, you can tell how old it is. It came out about 2500 BC, which is remarkably early for this part of the world. So I think in some ways we were rewriting the books. And it's okay discovering hoards of silver or gold, but I think the more mundane archaeology is also very interesting as well.
The Bronze Age people who buried their loved ones in stone kists with pots of food and drink were the first to work metal into tools, weapons and jewellery. They tracked the changing of the seasons and the passage of the sun and moon across the sky. They made a style of pot known as beakers.
The pots are formed entirely by hand. No potter's wheels or anything like that. That won't arrive in Britain until the Romans a good couple of thousand years later. You start with a bowl of clay, you pinch it out until you've raised up a reasonably sized pot. The decoration, generally speaking, in the Bronze Age is quite limited. On the actual surface of the pot, in the decoration, you can just see the lines of decoration have been built up by using the tool and then moving on to the next mark and the next mark. In addition to that, they're using cord to decorate, and that's pressing a piece of string literally into the surface of the pot to develop the sort of lined pattern that they build up. And in the case of the Fishwick beakers, we have 2 pots and we have both kinds of decoration. To the average museum goer, often bits of broken pots in cases can seem remarkably boring things, and I've always viewed my job as being to make them more exciting, to put them in contact with the original pottery, and that's how I feel when I pick up a piece of ancient pottery. you're immediately having a sort of conversation with that original potter. You can place your fingers and you can feel the impressions of their fingerprints. Being used to working clay, you know the sort of pressure that was applied when a certain mark was made. So it really is a real contact with that original potter. Almost certainly they're drinking vessels. And I think the assumption always was that this was placed in the grave, probably with a drink inside. It's like mead, possibly a rudimentary beer, that sort of thing. And the rims often are slightly shaped to suggest that they're for the lips. We've got decorative patterns which correspond with patterns found on pots which were excavated in the 1920s from Ross Links, just on the mainland not far from Holy Island, and the decoration is really, really close to these ones. I'm sure it's people of the same culture, maybe people of the same tribe, possibly the same potter. That would be an exciting one to find, that the same tools had been involved.
As we get closer to our own time, the archaeological finds were supplemented by information from written records.
Documentary research takes us back to about 1100, which shows that at that point the land was granted to the Coldingham Priory. There were 5 tenants and they were getting their land for service. So they had to spend a couple of days mowing. They then had to cut turfs for 4 days. They had to drive the sheep to the water. They were also required to help with the harvest. And the interesting thing is at that time, they were getting meat twice a day during the harvest time. The next mention is about 1300, and they talk about there being a manor with a dovecot. This was a food source, and I know that everybody always says the food source was for the winter time, but it wasn't actually. They ate the squabs, the young doves, the young pigeons, shortly after they were hatched. And this was the hungry time, the May, June, because the beasts weren't actually ready for slaughtering at that time, and it gave them fresh meat after a winter of eating salt meat and salt fish. A lot of those men who were not working during the harvest would actually have been out fishing at the salmon fishing. I would think that all of the salmon was supposed to be for market. Whether they were eating it or not is a moot point. It went through the Humes, it went through the Douglases, it went through the Blackadders, although the village seems to have disappeared. The 1300 and 1500 raids from England had damaged the borderlands considerably.
At last we can come face to face with the people who lived and worked in the parish before us.
If we look at the bones that have been found at the chapel, we can make an estimation that we do have roughly about 16 adults. We have about 17 perinatal children, and we also have 5 other juveniles aging from 1-year-old up to 9-year-old. These bones have been found in various different trenches around the site. We have very much an even ratio from adults to children. Children were actually buried with an adult that died around about the same time. They did believe that children should be buried with an individual that could look after them as they crossed over to the other side. We can look at sex, age, and we can also look for signs of disease on the bones. I've only managed to find 1 fracture, and we do have an area where the bone shows that it does have a break, and the actual thickness of the bone is caused by extra bone growth which established and grew around the time that the bone fused back together. Another bone that was found was part of a skull. Now, we haven't got any facial bones here. Now, I can do both a sex and an age estimation on this individual. If we look at the eyes, we can see that they're quite rounded, which is actually a male trait. I've also been able to determine signs of disease. We can see here in the eye orbits there's some little dots, little porous marks, which is very much a sign of vitamin D deficiency. Now, this bone that I have here, we do have a very prominent pinched area in the middle, which is very, very prominent in males. And we can also look at age for this individual, because in the mandible we do have a few teeth in situ, and if we look at the molars in particular, we can see that it's quite well worn, and this tells us that this individual again is roughly around 45 to 55 years of age. Here we have what we call a perinatal mandible. Now, this is probably from a stillborn infant. From the disarticulated remains from the chapel, we do have a lot of stillborn infants, and because they are being found quite close together, this may suggest that stillborn children were buried quite near to the chapel, so that when it rained, the rain would land onto the roof and drip down onto those burials, and that would be classed as the holy water for children that hadn't been able to be baptised.
The graveyard has graves in it up until 1800. One of them in particular that we saw was 1708. Now the gravestone was broken, but it's unusual because it's got writing on one side and a memento mori, a carving with a death head on it, a skull. It's meant to keep people aware of their mortality. The burial is "Here lies Beatrix Blackadder, spouse of Hendry Water, who died 1708. He remarried and had a further 4 children with his next wife. And the interesting bit is that I found was Alison married a Mr. Byrne, and they were the grandparents of the poultry woman who was on the first census here at Paxton Estate. So there's a real connection there.
Nearly 400 generations have walked this land before us, and the volunteers from the Paxton Before the House project have given us a brief glimpse into their lives. How much more is there for us to discover?